This video is going to help you think about why you might use a rubric, under what conditions, and how to create a good one. For many instructors, considering a rubric starts with one of two questions. Either how to get more reliability and consistency across multiple markers, or how to be confident that the sort of assessment that you're generating is a valid measure of the thing you were trying to know. Let's start with reliability and consistency. In higher education, often we're in a situation where we have multiple instructors marking the same course with the same course content, or we have an instructor and some TAs marking a set of student work. It's our goal always that a student who does basically equal quality work with another student gets the same kind of mark. However, that's challenging across multiple different people. When you have a rubric, one of the things that you do is really try to make the criteria as specific as possible, which helps all instructors to see something the same way. If you do the added step of trying to develop some inter-rater reliability, that can also really assist. That process looks like the instructors who are all marking something, practicing marking 3 of a set of assignments using the rubric, and then getting together and discussing how they each marked it and trying to achieve some consistency before they mark the rest. Validity is another concern that people raise. When you design an assessment, you want to be really confident that you're measuring the things that the assessment is designed to focus on. So when you build a rubric, you go back to your course outcomes and you try to figure out very specifically what you have taught that this particular assignment is trying to measure. And then you build those into the categories and use the specific criteria based on the approach you use to teaching it. Those help to ensure that an assignment is focused on the things that you care the most about, and extra details that were less significant get omitted. One thing we don't discuss as often that's just as significant is the amount of learning that comes from a rubric. When you build a rubric, either co-constructing it with a class of students or providing one for them, students get much more explicit criteria about what good looks like. And when you know what it is you're trying to practice, you can do a much better job of focusing your energy on doing it well. Good rubrics also articulate what examples of getting better at something are. So they describe a satisfactory level or an exemplary level, and you can see the step just above yours. Research indicates that rubrics are actually one of the most helpful teaching tools that we have for helping our students to understand how they can get better at a thing that matters to us. When you're thinking about building a rubric, always do a quick double check for yourself and make sure a rubric is the tool you want. Sometimes in higher education we use the term very generally when we mean rating scale, checklist, just a description, or some kind of a continuum. I'm going to briefly discuss each of them in case it's actually something else you're looking for. A rating scale is a general statement of how well you do at something, satisfactory or excellent, for example. It often has an associated mark and a general statement, but isn't designed to be applied to a specific assignment. The function of a rating scale is more to help ensure that two general areas, for example, chemistry and computer science, would treat a 70 in the same kind of way. A checklist is a thing with yes or no's. Did you have a title page? Check. Have you used APA citation? Check. Checklists are structures that are not designed to check degree of success, but rather to check to see that something has been included that must be. A description associated with success criteria is often just a single thing that says, this is what good enough looks like. Sometimes we will call those 2-point rubrics, not good enough and good enough, to clarify for students what we really want. Often chunks of an assignment description that faculty members include when they hand out the assignment fit in this category, but could actually become elements of an effective rubric later. The final possibility is a continuum. A continuum is a series of samples of student work, ordered from best to worst or vice versa. And usually, after we have permission to use those things, we include a brief description with them. What does this sample paragraph have that the next one below it doesn't? And that helps students to place their work on a continuum and say, my work looks the most like this and here's why, and to see the description of the next thing up, to see how to improve their work. A continuum is used when something that we're asking students to do is very complex or requires lots of careful refinement. The biggest problem with rubrics and what undermines their effectiveness in terms of what we want to accomplish is when they're too ineffective or vague. This is an example of an ineffective rubric looking at observations. This could apply to observations about myself and a portfolio of my work. It could apply to observations that occur in a laboratory situation. In this case, this is not behaving like a rubric for a number of reasons. First of all, some of the descriptors are not sufficiently detailed. It would be possible that lots of different people would interpret them in different ways. If I'm insufficient, for example, this rubric provides no detail about what caused me to be insufficient or how I would know if I was insufficient as opposed to basic, the level up. A good rubric has sufficient observable description that multiple people would recognize an example of that and give it the same rating. Another problem with this rubric is that it has information in it which is not connected to the category of observation. For example, the fact that there are many spelling errors. When you're building a rubric, you want to really clarify what you're looking at in this category and separate it out from the other categories, because one of the things that a rubric does well is helps a learner figure out, were my problems in my observations, or is it that I didn't do a good enough job of carefully editing my work? A rubric helps clarify which ones of those things are important. Another problem in this rubric is that the scale is not focused on the places where it's most difficult to try to distinguish. For example, 70 to 90 is one big category, even though on campus we spend a lot of time differentiating in that 20-mark range. The job of a rubric is to help clarify between close but not the same students in terms of the quality of the work that we are receiving. So this rubric is not very good from that perspective. Another problem which gets lots of conversation from students, particularly as they do more competency-based work in high schools, is where is that last 10%? This rubric only goes up to 90, implying that the assignment is out of 90, even though the professor is marking theoretically out of 100. Always make your rubric go to the top available mark, even if you intend to give it very rarely. This is a better rubric for observations. It has more description that helps a person figure out why did they wind up where they were. Here it says that the observations were incomplete, very similar to the rubric before when a student just handed in partial work, but it also includes too general to be useful. You generate that description by talking about, when I get poor work, what do I typically see? And you'll say something like, well, a student just hands in these super general observations, which could be true of almost everything, so I don't know if they actually understand. You take that description and you turn it into something that's in the rubric. Some other good things about this rubric are, you can see as you move up through the levels, poor to acceptable to good to excellent, what is being added each time to make it better, but also what makes it not quite as good as the category above it. I get the question sometimes if you should start with the top rating in the rubric or start with the bottom rating in the rubric. You hear things depending on which researchers you're consulting about which is better here. There isn't clear research that's absolutely definitive on which method is better. However, in this example, the most significant thing to student learning is, for example, how you can see how acceptable is different than poor and different than good. In the acceptable example, the observations are focused, which makes them better than the general, but they're just focused on the obvious, which means not a lot of learning has occurred. There are examples, but they're partially connected to the observations. So it's easy to see why the examples wouldn't necessarily show that the person really understood what they were attempting to observe. When you move up to the good level, you can see that the observations are specific and concrete, and the examples are explaining them. And that's what makes that movement up. When you see that kind of description, you know a rubric is going to be easy for multiple people to use, including students, to understand how they could improve. When you go to build your own rubric, start by breaking out what categories you want to talk about. In this example, we are discussing a discussion board. I'm going to ask my students to post their thinking about things, and I want to know which things I'd like to pay attention to when I'm evaluating the quality of what they say. So obviously, I want to think about the quality of their thinking around the topic. From a writing perspective, because we're all going to be reading these discussion boards posts, it's actually really important to me that my students are clear and brief. If I don't have this type of a criteria, it's likely that two things will happen. One, my students won't have to practice summarizing and figuring out the most important points, which is a key skill that I want and an important disciplinary thinking skill. The second is that we will all read long and confusing posts that no one takes the time to edit, and that's a problem from a workflow point of view. So I'm combining both the educational goal that I have and the goal that I have in terms of my own work-life balance and that of my students. It's also important to me from a disciplinary point of view that my students are making overt connections between what they're saying and research or ideas that are coming in from other places, because that's the kind of thinking I want them to do as researchers and academics. So I've got that as a category. Finally, it's important to me that they acknowledge where they're getting ideas from, that they respectfully build on the ideas of others, and that their approach to others is appropriate and keeps my classroom environment positive. So I have a category around that. If you want to incentivize particular ways of behaving, it is okay to include that in the rubric, provided it's consistent with your classroom goals. So what I have here now is a progression from the lowest possible, less than 50%, to the highest possible, 85% plus. One thing that researchers would recommend here actually is I don't have my middlemost column, because many of us score just in the middle habitually, as we do when we, for example, are rating things on a survey. So you might choose to have just 4 so that you don't have kind of an easy middle to go to. When I'm trying to write my descriptors, I go back to thinking what I have observed around that. So a really strong person in my class who writes with strong clarity and brevity about something in the 85 plus category, what does that look like? It looks like focusing on the most essential points. It might look like using very strong, clear language to say things efficiently. It might look like a student who is able to lift off a point that someone else has made by summarizing it in one sentence, for example, rather than reusing too much of it. So I think of examples that I've seen and I put them in that category for 85% plus. Then I can either work down from there and say, well, if I take away something from there, what puts you in that lower category? What leaves? Or I can then go right to the bottom and say to myself, when my clarity and brevity is really not good, so bad that I would choose to fail you, what does that look like? And I create that description and work up. The process of building a rubric is really helpful because it helps you really say as an instructor, what is it that I'm really looking for here? Sometimes you might do that with your students and talk through this process together. Sometimes you pre-build it in advance because you want the language to be really specific and students to have a really clear understanding with past examples. These are the key things that you need to pay attention to when you're thinking about, do I need a rubric and how to make a rubric? If you have further questions, feel free to contact the Gwenna Moss Centre for Teaching and Learning. We have a variety of resources and courses you can take related to assessment tools, and we're always happy to support you with a one-on-one consultation.